So let's shift a little bit into the neurotransmitters here. So let's correlate this first with everybody loves training and performance. And obviously a big thing is supplementation, pre-training, like pre-workouts are all the rage. You got everybody taking either stimulants or nootropics or whatever it may be. Now let's talking about that. So, and again, let's put context to this. So in my opinion, like caffeine's not bad. Like nothing's bad. But when it comes to improving performance and making sure recovery is on point, like with the neurotransmitter, like dopamine, right? Like that's a big one people talk about a lot. What supplementation first do you see that affects that the most? Obviously, I think tyrosine is probably the most well-known, like people, that's the most common. Like I'm gonna take tyrosine to increase my dopamine levels. And dopamine's that kind of reward center of the brain. And then you're getting the pleasure, and it also improves motor function, if I'm not mistaken.
It does play a role in motor function.
So let's say caffeine versus the dopamine, or is there an interrelation between the two? Because everybody, like, that's probably the most common is caffeine, obviously. Everybody takes caffeine pre-workout, whether it's freaking first thing in the morning or 8 p.m. at night. It's like they have to have that hit of caffeine before they train. But obviously now in the world that we're trying to integrate more cognitive-based supplementation that aren't like quote unquote stimulant-based like caffeine, do you see have you seen a difference in that? Like people that say they take caffeine pre-workout as opposed to just like a cognitive-based supplement?
You're seeing more of a change in the way people look at their pre-workout nutrition, whereas I don't want to say early on, but up until recently, there was a heavy focus on stimulants, and a pre-workout or somebody's pre-workout nutrition, the efficacy of it was kind of based on how stimulating it was. Their perceived efficacy of it was based on how stimulating it was. And I mean, I think the both of us know that that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
And again, depending on what your goal of training is, you might want to take different things. Like the same pre-workout nutrition may not work if you're a power lifter and you're going in for like, oh, I'm testing my 1RM today versus I'm going in to induce cellular swelling and do all these other things.
That's phenomenal. Right? I love how you just pointed that out.
So, I mean, when you look at things like, but you are seeing an uptick in people using ingredients or compounds that are known to stimulate neurological function. You're seeing an uptick in the use of those. We'll throw out the blanket term nootropics for some of those. Mm-hmm. You're seeing an uptick in the use of those either as an integration with someone's pre-workout training or as a stand-in for what used to be there. But when you look at things like caffeine and obviously, like you're gonna be hard pressed to find somebody that doesn't use caffeine. And of course, of course, those oddballs exist, and like good for them. But excuse me, caffeine. I mean, it's the most consumed psychostimulant in the world, and it does stimulate the release of something like dopamine. Mm-hmm. When you look at tyrosine, what tyrosine does is it provides substrate for the production of dopamine, because downstream of tyrosine is dopamine. You have the essential amino acid phenylalanine, which is converted into tyrosine, among other things. And then tyrosine converts into L-DOPA, and then L-DOPA in the brain converts into dopamine. Excuse me. So supplementing with tyrosine by itself doesn't necessarily cause an uptick in dopamine production. It increases your pool of substrate for dopamine production, but a lot of times catecholamine production, and catecholamines are neurotransmitter within that category of neurotransmitter, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, because dopamine can convert into norepinephrine, norepinephrine and epinephrine. But those neurotransmitters are primarily produced on like an as needed basis. Mm-hmm. So if I just took 500 milligrams of tyrosine, which is like a standard pill, that doesn't mean that I'm going to have any reasonable uptick in dopamine. But what it does mean is if I need to start producing dopamine, like I start going to exert myself, or if a car comes crashing through the wall and my fight or flight has to kick in, then I should have the substrate to produce dopamine and potentially not deplete myself if I were to otherwise without enough substrate. Yeah. Whereas taking in caffeine will trigger the release and production of dopamine. So they can actually have synergy together, whereas caffeine will stimulate dopamine production and tyrosine makes sure that you have substrate for dopamine production. And then, as you said, like dopamine plays a role. And obviously we know it mostly as the motivation neurotransmitter. I think a lot of people know it. Actually, they call it the pleasure neurotransmitter, which is, it's a bit inaccurate. It would be more accurately classified as the motivation neurotransmitter. Yeah. And then, it does play a role, like you said, in motor function. And we see that in people with Parkinson's disease, who suffer from the degeneration of a lot of the dopaminergic system. And that's where you see like tremors, and an inability to actually control, like fine motor control goes down when people lack dopamine. So if you really understand how these compounds work, then you can choose ones that interact with each other in a way that complement one another, rather than just kind of like, and that's the problem with like most pre-workouts that are thrown together. Yeah. A lot of times in sports nutrition, they might be like put together by the manufacturer, which are like, you have a lot of like hot term products where people just, they know it. Like, ooh, like I like that, I'll take it. And then you look at like the string of things and you're just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And the way that I kind of, the analogy that I use is, a lot of times if people ask me to critique a product, like, hey, I don't do that publicly, but because that would be like criticizing another artist's work or something. But sometimes you can look at a product and be like, well, if this person was a chef, like I can go into the kitchen and throw together a bunch of different things that taste good, and I can produce something that tastes good and that you'll enjoy. But as far as the purpose behind it and the art behind it, like, is it a high level cuisine where this is being added because it complements this and for a certain reason, or are you just throwing a bunch of things that taste good together for no particular reason? And it's kind of it's difficult in sports nutrition to differentiate between the two if you're on the outside of things. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of marketing, obviously, is to look at like specific ingredients or hot marketed substances like caffeine or tyrosine or whatever it may be. And people will just see that because they're familiar with it. Like, oh, wow, it has these ingredients, so it must be good. But then also the dosing of them makes a difference too. Now, question for you too, with those two, like say, because you have caffeine and you have L-tyrosine working on two different pathways in a sense. Would you see an issue, like, have you seen an issue to where, like, if they're taking substantial amounts of caffeine along with substantial amounts of tyrosine, to where that could have like a negative effect? Like, you're seeing pre-workout drinks with 300 to 400 milligrams of caffeine and then 1,000 milligrams of tyrosine in there. Do you see that causing an issue where it's high doses of both? Yeah. I mean, you can see that at times. And again, depending on what we're talking about, like are we seeing problems with, or is that optimal for something like cognitive function? Is it optimal for physical performance? And there's different answers to both of those things, but also again, like looking at the goal, like I guess let's focus on physical performance. Yep. And if we're looking at the difference between strength, like training for strength versus training for something like hypertrophy, even though those things are interrelated, overlap. Yeah. Even though they have plenty of overlap to them, taking high amounts of stimulants may not give you as much vasodilation as you would have hoped to get otherwise. Actually, this is interesting because somebody had asked me this question actually 2 days ago here in this gym. They're like, I don't understand why people take caffeine for working out like in this gym, because a lot of people are in this gym to produce muscle, maybe not care so much about strength. But he's like, isn't that like counterintuitive to like blood flow? And I was like, well, I mean, not necessarily. Like caffeine acts on different structures, and depending on the structures it's acting on and the concentrations you're taking it in at, and then also the time course over which it's interacting with those structures, it can promote vasodilation and nitric oxide production, or it can antagonize it. And so it depends, like, what are you walking into the gym to do? Like, I know that a lot of people, I mean, myself included, there are some days where you're just like, I just want to be stimmed up because I don't know that I can get through much at the level I would like to without reaching a certain level of neurological stimulation. But there is a principle, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, and it mostly applies to, it mostly applies to things like cognitive function, but you can look at it in terms of physical performance. And that's where taking a certain amount of any compound confers a benefit, and like specifically stimulating compounds confers a benefit, but then past a point, the curve looks like an an inverted U. So it goes up, you get benefit. And then once the dose increases here on the x-axis, then all of a sudden performance starts to go down the more stimulating something is. And you see that more often in cognition. When you look at things like caffeine and tyrosine, there's actually like a lot of studies looking at this in doses laid out. As for physical performance, there's not a lot of, you're not going to find a lot of research of somebody who took 500 milligrams of caffeine and wasn't as strong.
Sure.
You know, but you'll look at somebody who took 500 milligrams of caffeine and couldn't perform as well on a working memory task or something like that. So even though physical performance and cognition also have overlap, it's difficult to, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm going back to what we've been stressing this whole time, is what exactly are you in the gym trying to do? You know,
I think the different training stimulus is huge. So like someone that's doing neurological based stimulus, which is strength based training with a lower volume, longer rest periods, it's not very glycolytic in nature. And then obviously you're doing hypertrophy stimulus, which is obviously a lot more volume. You're going to get more cell swelling effects. You want more vasodilation going on in that effect. And then you have the extreme of that, which is obviously just pure metabolic stress type training, which you're driving up like AMPK through the roof. Energy rate, the rate of energy production has got to be really high. The mitochondria is being, redlined basically the entire time that you're training. So you have like almost like three kind of categories of types of training. And then, like you said, being a little bit more specific to, well, okay, what am I doing with training? What am I trying to get out of training? What it's going to kind of benefit me the most going into that type of training, right? So like with the caffeine thing, because I hear that a lot with people like, well, I don't take caffeine pre-workout for my hypertrophy work or pump work or whatever because of the vasoconstriction. Like people will see that. That's like common out here now. Like it's just vasoconstrict your muscles. It's pointless. You should not take it because it's going to make you perform worse in the gym, which that's an argument in and of itself. Right. And then you have the people with doing like the neurological based training, which they'll also argue nutrition on top of the supplementation because it isn't glycolytic in nature, even though obviously you are using glucose. But they want to they focus solely on like cognitive based nootropics more than anything because it's that all out effort for, a very short period of time, like the 1-2 reps, maybe 3 reps. And they just want focus more than they want anything else. They're not looking for that heightened response or that, I don't know how to put this, when you take caffeine and it kind of gives you that wired feeling, so to speak. I don't look to like powerlifters and neurological based trainings wanting to go in and feel that way. Right. Do you see that same thing? Well,
caffeine, I think it's important for people to know that caffeine itself could be, under its classical definition, considered a nootropic. We just don't consider it that because nootropic's like a hot term. And we've been using caffeine since the dawn of time. So I think that, and like you alluded to different types of training. I think when you go into the research, and I mean, neuromuscular physiology is what I studied in grad school, and I don't really read a whole lot of research nowadays in terms of the hypertrophy research. It also, like, a lot of what changes now are the nuances and things, but you have the overarching principles of hypertrophy of muscular tension, cell swelling, and then muscle damage, which has always been, actually not always been, I mean, cell swelling and muscle damage. And that's the way
I look at hypertrophy. I kind of look at it in like an umbrella of 3 bigger things like mechanical damage, mechanical tension, and then sarcoplasmic based.
Cell swelling and muscle tension have been the two of the more controversial of the, muscular tension, probably the primary driver of something like hypertrophy. And there was a time where it was thought that training volume was the main determinant of adaptation, specifically skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And if that is the way that somebody decided to train, then you would want your nutrition and supplementation going in to promote prolonged, performing at a high level for a prolonged period of time. So you might want your rest periods to be longer, but you also need the substrate to continually lift a certain absolute level of volume at the end of the day without fatiguing yourself into a hole. So, excuse me. So caffeine in that sense would be good for promoting performance over the course of a workout. But you could also look to some of these other nootropic compounds to achieve something similar. And I don't think so. I don't necessarily think that caffeine shouldn't be used. I think for whatever your purpose is, caffeine could be used for all of them, just maybe in different concentrations with different types of supplementation interwoven, or nutrition prior to. But I do see a shift now in people looking for alternatives to caffeine, or at least trying to keep caffeine lower, because I know we're talking about training, but we don't just consume caffeine when we're training. No. We tend to consume our highest amount of the day prior to training. And that might be a good strategy, but then outside of those periods too, we do want to make sure that caffeine isn't being taken too late in the day, and that we're also controlling for our total daily intake, because it affects both our physical and cognitive performance when we're not taking caffeine. How much we're taking in a day affects our performance in all facets of life outside of the periods that caffeine's even active in our system.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the big thing, is because people aren't just taking it pre-workout. I mean, society today, people are living off caffeine for the most part because the stress they have in life, and obviously the effects that's having over a chronic period of time, when you're like wanting your adrenals to continuously produce cortisol, like in the morning, then you have a meeting in the middle of the day. I got to get stemmed up for that. Then I'm going to train in the evening. I got stemmed up for that. And they're doing this day in, day out. And then they're having a lot of that, mental, emotional stress, which acts same, physiologically inside you as physical stress. Stress is just stress. And you're compounding that issue by, you already have cortisol through the roof because you're just stressed out of your head. And now you're kind of inducing that every time you're taking caffeine, and if you're taking caffeine all day long, you can only produce so much cortisol for a certain period of time. And I don't want to say adrenal fatigue, more like kind of like adrenal dysfunction in a sense, to where your adrenals, kind of get tired in a sense, but it will start pulling from other hormones. And what we've seen is like it'll pull from progesterone to produce more cortisol, but then you're depleting progesterone levels. And okay, if you're in a female and you're depleting your progesterone levels, then that's going to have a trickle down effect to other hormones in the body.
Yeah. So
right?
you compensate. Yeah. And I think that's like, so I know like adrenal dysfunctions, like I guess like another one of those hot terms. And you see practitioners use it a lot more than people in research. And that one's like, there's a big divide between like, what's going on there. And, and so like, I've talked to enough people who are practitioners and also like looked enough at the research to, I think, see where like some of the miscommunication is happening, which I'm sure you have. But, for the common person, like I know that what you mean when you say adrenal dysfunction. For the common person, I think it's important for them to know that the adrenals aren't necessarily dysfunctional at that time, but if you are depleting resources in one area and you start drawing from another, that's the body compensating, and that's an adaptation. Mm-hmm. And it's not an adaptation to compensate isn't necessarily dysfunctional. It's very functional. The problem is it's just more maladaptive than it is adaptive. And when you look at, when you look at people who are highly stressed and taking in a lot of caffeine, people who are habituated to caffeine, you don't actually get, assuming you're not taking in 500 milligrams of caffeine at a time, assuming your caffeine intake is reasonable, you're having a cup of coffee, it really doesn't spike your cortisol that much. What it does is it prevents you from decreasing it. Mm-hmm. So if you're already highly stressed and cortisol is high, then taking in a lot of caffeine over the course of the day, that may not necessarily be driving your cortisol up higher, but it isn't doing you any favors in trying to bring it down to levels that over time aren't going to be harmful for you. Yeah.
And that's the whole thing. When we say these things, and when I talk about them, it's always chronic periods. It's never acute periods. Like your body's fine with acute periods of pretty much anything, and it can self-regulate. It'll be fine. You'll be good to go. It's when this is a day in and day out, months upon months upon months. It's not weeks, it's months. When I'm talking in this contextually, guys. So let's move a little bit in a different direction here. So we talked about dopamine to a level. Now let's actually go into, let's talk a little bit about GABA. GABA is still like, it's a well-known supplement at this time. There's arguments with that about, supplementing with it. Is it beneficial? Is it not? Blood-brain barrier, all that fun stuff. What have you seen or what's your opinion in the efficiency of taking GABA as a supplement.
So there aren't, to date, there aren't any clinical studies showing that showing if GABA is making supplemental GABA is making its way into the human brain efficiently. There are clinical studies using GABA showing beneficial outcomes in things like stress, anxiety, and even depression, and then sleep as well. The theory is that it's possibly stimulating the vagal nerve, because when you stimulate that, GABA levels in cerebral spinal fluid go up, at least in rodents. But there are a lot of rodent studies that look at GABA supplementation, and showing that some GABA actually does, some circulating plasma GABA will make its way into the brain, and that there probably are some transporters for it. The problem is the efflux rate of GABA. So GABA leaving the brain is much higher than the levels of GABA entering the brain. Okay. I think that the efflux rate in rodents, and again, it's important for people to know that animal data, we can't translate to human data, but it may give us ideas as to what might be happening in a human. So the efflux rate in rodents was like 17 times higher than the influx rate, which is probably why higher levels of GABA couldn't be detected in the brain after supplementation. And then the research came out showing, okay, well, when you stimulate the vagal nerve through GABA supplementation, then GABA levels go up in cerebral spinal fluid, and that might be making its way into the brain to show some benefit. If you're somebody who self-experiments a reasonable amount, like I do and have, and I've had other people who are highly educated, probably more so than me, and work in the same field, and we all have kind of agreed on taking higher levels of higher amounts of supplemental GABA for. I'll just talk acutely, because I don't think you should do that chronically, but taking it in the gram ranges, so somewhere between 1 and 5 grams, that's a big range. Oh, yeah. But you do at least feel something. And I can't say objectively what exactly is going on, but I know if I'm taking around 3 grams of GABA, I do feel that. Yeah. And, in the end, and I don't believe it's a placebo, even if there's some placebo noise in there accounting for some of the efficacy, then sure, I'll take it. I'm a fan of the placebo effect, but I do think taking higher amounts of GABA does have some type of efficacy. However, how it's doing so in humans isn't really fleshed out. But even taking, like I said, there is clinical data on taking lower amounts of GABA, as low as 100 milligrams of certain types of GABA, maybe like patented types of GABA that have funded this type of research, showing that it does have effects on sleep, anxiety, and depression. So I do think it can be efficacious as a supplement. I'm just not necessarily sure how it's doing so in different people. There's a large range for people to all the way from 100 milligrams up to 5 grams. So deciding for an individual, where in that range would it be beneficial for them, depending on what they're using it for. Yeah.
I mean, that makes, because I've continued to hear that argument over the last 10 years. It's a worthless supplement. It's a great supplement. It's just a back and forth. It's still going to this day that people are arguing over that. But I like you. I mean, like, if I take certain doses of certain supplementation, maybe it's GABA, and you have, whether it's placebo or not, I feel something different. And if I feel something different and it's in a positive manner, then hey, who am I to say, or someone else is to say yes or no to, like, no, it's worthless. Well, okay, maybe in your view, but in my experience, I'm not seeing that. But again, nothing's going to work the same in everybody anyways, right? As far as dosing goes.
You can also, there's actually like an interesting tidbit. There was a rodent study showing that when nitric oxide was increased, in addition to supplemental GABA, that GABA concentration in the brain went up by 300% compared to when nitric oxide wasn't being induced in another group of rodents. So I don't know if that holds true for humans, but I've practiced it before. I'm like, I wonder if I'm taking a couple compounds in addition to the GABA that increase NO, because NO can increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. Then I wonder if that's having the same or some kind of some kind of a similar effect in humans. And so, like, you know, if you can take information like that and play with it, and find ways to apply it to people in which it works, and maybe it works through placebo, and maybe it works through something else, but that's also an interesting little tidbit for experimentation for people. And of course, if anybody's self-experimenting, it helps to be knowledgeable, and it always helps to be as conservative as possible starting out. I don't promote
least effective dose.
There you go. That's what I mean.
So let's go down to another one here. So this is a popular one people know about is serotonin, right? So serotonin kind of regulates your mood. It can regulate your appetite, but it's also a precursor to melatonin, correct? So,
correct.
I also see, and I actually saw you make a post about this, and this is something I've actually been playing around with, is the relationship between dopamine and serotonin, and how one can deplete the other, like as far as, because they want to be in balance for the most part. Because we're doing organic acids tests a lot, like with the Dutch test that we do, right? And it's a urine test, and it shows neurotransmitters, it shows your norepinephrine, epinephrine, melatonin production, oxidative stress, all these fun things. And we'll see someone that's like, their dopamine levels are crazy low, right? Like it's just like almost non-existent sometimes. And then to me, that's correlating. Okay, well then you can see their melatonin levels on the organic acid as well. And typically I always see the correlation of if one's low, the other is low, right? And then we want to put something into play, obviously, to bring those levels back up. Obviously, just because typically in those situations, these guys have a lot more anxiety, they're more depressed. So obviously we want to help correct that. I'm sure there's other stuff that could be going on up the chain as well when we're talking about hormones. But with that balancing thing, so like if someone sees like a test and it's like, oh, my dopamine levels are low, so I'm going to go take a lot of tyrosine to bring my dopamine levels up, or take L-Dopa, because obviously that's a supplement form as well. People will take that to bring their dopamine levels up. But if you do that and you're like taking that too high for too long, do you see that negatively affecting like the serotonin production as well?
Now the Dutch test, 'cause I know that you're big on the Dutch test. Are those neurotransmitter assays, are they urine or plasma based?
Urine.
Okay. So this is interesting before we jump into the balance, excuse me, because it's not obvious that those tests are useful for determining neurotransmitters in the brain. Now, neurotransmitters do, and more evidence is coming out to show what they do and support how they do it. They're important for peripheral signaling of things. Like serotonin plays a massive role in gut motility, in mucin production in the gut, and too much of it or too little of it, not good. Too much circulating serotonin in the periphery can have very damaging effects on cardiac tissue. But when you're looking at urine levels or plasma levels, it's not obvious, and there's no indication that even has any relation to the levels in the brain. And also, importantly, dopamine and serotonin in the periphery, they can't even cross the blood-brain barrier, which is why I personally have never been a big fan of something like 5-HTP for serotonin production, because it's converted by decarboxylase enzymes in the gut into serotonin. And once that conversion happens, you don't get it into the brain. So I've always been more of a fan of L-tryptophan. Granted, some people think that they respond better to 5-HTP. So I'm not going to say, just because if you look at all the body of data on something like 5-HTP for serotonin and mood, excuse me, there are almost no studies where 5-HTP performs any better than a placebo, even if there's a significant effect. So I'm not going to say that because it hasn't been shown that it's not effective. Sure. I'm just going to say that so far everything that has been shown suggests that it's not as effective as people think it is, but also that conclusion's open to revision based on new information. L-tryptophan would be more likely to make its way into the brain and then conversion into serotonin there. So the type of precursor you're supplementing with, and the same holds true for supplementing with L-Dopa.
As opposed to tyrosine.
As opposed to tyrosine. And that one's a little bit more complicated because depending on where you're getting your L-DOPA, like Vicuna pruriens is a common one.
Yep.
There's actually some data in people with Parkinson's suggesting that some of the other constituents in Vicuna pruriens helps that L-DOPA to bypass peripheral conversion and make its way into the brain. So that's why I'm not really a big fan of seeing Vicuna pruriens that are standardized to 95% L-DOPA, because it's not really giving you, it likely isn't giving you enough of the other helpful constituents in that extract that may be helping the L-DOPA make its way into the brain. But that's also like theory based off literature and Parkinson's patients. But circulating levels, excuse me, of neurotransmitters, they're important for certain biological functions, but it's not obvious that they're a useful tool in determining somebody's brain levels of those things. Because I've been curious. I've taken a urine test before, pretty recently, and I get it back, and according to my test, I don't produce neurotransmitters, like at all. Like every single one of them is low. And I was like, I don't even even assuming that those tests don't mean anything for what's going on in my brain, I don't even know how that's possible.
Yeah.
You know, I was like, I'm not even producing neurotransmitters. Everything's like on the
let me ask you this too. When you did the urine test, did you limit your water intake?
Well, let's see. I don't remember what I did the day before. That was one of those.
One thing that I found, and I started making people do, is I restrict them to 25, 30 ounces of water for the entire day.
Makes enough sense,
to
right?
drive, because it's metabolites is what we're testing, right? So I want high concentrations of that. And if you're diluting that, drinking a shit ton of water, I've seen a patient / client, we had them do a Dutch test, and they drank like their regular water intake, like 100 ounces a day. And then it's like these levels like made no sense, especially correlating them with their blood work. And then I had them restrict their water. We had them restrict their water to 30 ounces or so, and it come back, and it was more. There's a much more correlation between that and blood panels. Like I saw, it was like a 9-day shift. And one thing that I can see, like on the Dutch panel, is you can see their creatinine source or their levels, and if you see those are like low, like really low, like a 0.5 or lower, that means they drank too much. Their water intake was very high, so stuff is diluted. So we can typically see a higher concentration of the creatinine levels in correlation to, okay, they're not diluting the results. We're getting a higher concentration of these metabolites to see a better ideal of what's going on. Is it 100%? Of course, it's not 100%. But that's what I've played with. Like, okay, I'm starting to see difference. So like with testing in and of itself, especially like with urine, I think that's a huge factor, is like water intake. Yeah,
with urine tests, it is important to do those. Probably restrict your water at some point the day before, and then use, I think, not your first, but maybe your second urination after waking up as a proxy for.
And with the Dutch, we do 5.
Okay.
So it makes it
over the course of it. Yeah.
So it's like everything from like as soon as you get up all the way until 10 p.m. before bed. So you're getting a lot more data in there to correlate, not just like
more than
a screenshot or something.
Snapshot.
Right. So that's why I like Dutch test, because there's a lot more going on instead of just like screenshotting one part of the day, so to speak.
That's true. There's different tests. You have the snapshot one, then you can I remember one of the other tests is you can take it's like this big like orange jug and you keep it in your fridge and you paint it over the course of like a day or two, and then you send it into the lab. And I didn't do that one because I just didn't have like the attention for it at the time. But so it's, when looking at peripheral neurotransmitters for people, it's just like it's important for them to know that, so that they don't look at that. And because a lot of times people will get those tests and then they start stressing out about their health.
Yep.
And then they may jump into some kind of treatment plan for themselves that isn't totally necessary, or it may not confer much benefit and possibly confer some type of harm. And when you start getting into neurochemistry and trying to play with your own neurochemistry, like you can get tangled up in the web really quickly. And people, you start traveling down a rabbit hole that for some people can be really hard to come back from, depending on what they're doing, because there's not a whole lot of reliable ways and not a lot of practical ways for people to know what's going on in their head at a given time, right? Like we can't, in a perfect world, we'd be able to open up our brain, take a sample, or remove some serum and see what exactly is going on, but we just can't. We can't do that. So it's important for people to like know these nuances before they stress themselves out, and then they jump into some kind of treatment regimen of which they might be traveling down a road that they don't know how to get back from.
And that's the thing too, is like with testing, make sure someone's actually interpreting it, that has a lot of experience, knows what's going on, because when I obviously interpret these for clients and they see the results, like they're freaking out all over the place. Like, well, calm down now. Yeah. You're not correlating a lot of these things. Like even with the organic acid test is like, we'll see a lot of stuff. Like if you have methylation issues or whatever, okay, you have a possible vitamin B deficiency. You're not methylating things properly. There could be simple little things like deficiencies that we just need to improve. Or if you're estrogen dominant or, androgen dominant, whatever, that can affect other things as well. So it's not like you need to immediately go to, okay, we need to support dopamine, or we need to add these in for serotonin or whatever. Let's fix this other stuff first. Then we retest, and we've seen those numbers come back just fine. You can't like throw the kitchen sink protocol at somebody because every part of this test is like off, and people do that a lot, right? We need to take these in like a step by step. But going back to the serotonin and dopamine, like to bring up dopamine levels, I like L-DOPA more than I do tyrosine. Mm-hmm. And what I've done, and I'm playing around, and obviously I've experimented a lot with the serotonin, and I like the tryptophan. What is what you like over top of 5-HTP, because I've used 5-HTP in the past, and yeah, it's like kind of like hit or miss with people, but like using those two as a supplement, but using them like with one another, meaning that I like to cycle them, like, because in my thought process, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, because of that relationship between dopamine and serotonin, is like I can't just focus on one, right? Because it affects the other. So if I'm just like pushing one like crazy, I think it's going to negatively affect the other one, and I want both of them to be more optimal. So I will actually cycle between like using L-DOPA for say 2 weeks, and then tryptophan for 2 weeks, and like go back and forth just to bring some balance up between the two.
That's one possible way to do it. There are probably several ways to do it, but yeah, when you're looking at something like amino acid therapy is typically what it's called, to try to support neurotransmitter activity in one way or another. If you're providing substrate in a way that's going to compete with another substrate for its synthesis, metabolism, transport, then over time you can cause diminished amounts of one neurochemical over another. Excuse me. And so it's important. I guess you can't isolate a single neurochemical response. Yeah. It's not possible. Yeah. If you get an uptick in dopamine, it's going to trigger something else. Somewhere down the line, it's going to trigger something else. And then you have positive and negative feedback loops that are going to affect it as well. But when you're just looking at supplementing to support one, it's important to, again, look at the whole thing as a system of interconnectedness. And excuse me. And I wouldn't supplement tyrosine indefinitely without thinking about, okay, if dopamine and serotonin kind of act on a seesaw in some parts of the brain, then what am I doing to support this other system so that I'm not harming it in any way? And I think that, to what you said, you can go through a periodic supplementation with one, then another. I've seen practitioners use methods in where somebody might be struggling with depression, and so they want to try to support serotonin functioning. So what they would do is supply something like 5-HTP or L-tryptophan in a 4 or 3 to 1 ratio with something like L-tyrosine, and then also I'll say a 4 or 3 to 1 to 1 ratio with L-tyrosine and a sulfur-containing amino acid like cysteine, because sulfur amino acids also, excuse me, sulfur amino acids like methionine, cysteine, taurine, and was the last one's escaping me, but most times people aren't going to supplement with methionine, and they can get enough of that through their diet. And obviously you don't want too much of that to begin with. But yeah, so when you're trying to decide what to do, like if you just take L-tyrosine before your workout a couple times a week, is that going to have a consequential effect on long-term neurotransmitter health when you're looking at other systems? Like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But there are people who wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is drink their brain shake.
Yep.
And then you do that, several times a week or every day, and over a period of time, you may start experiencing, negative effects as it relates to whatever neurotransmitter system you're affecting. So there's different ways you can do it. You can do it like you've explained to it if you're doing it regularly, or you can start to play around with ratios. But when you do that, then again, it helps to have an understanding of what's going on, or possibly be working with a practitioner who has experience with, doing this with a lot of people over a period of time, because I would even be cautious to attempt amino acid therapy on somebody, especially as a first line treatment,
it's not first line therapy.
It's definitely not. No, because it's very experimental. There's not a whole lot of ways to measure it objectively. A lot of the benefits you may or may not see, benefits or negative consequences, are going to be subjective.
100%. So let's touch on one more. This is one I've been playing around with too recently, is oxytocin. So that's the one, you're talking about dopamine being the kind of love hormone. Like, this to me is the love hormone, so to speak, or love one that people talk about because it's, touch and feel and all that, whatever. So with oxytocin, we've been playing around with it in the practitioner field to improve things or help like females with like amenorrhea, like cycle regulation.
Using like intranasal administration?
We sell it on the medical website.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is nice. So that's been a big help with Dom putting it on there. And we're still in like beta testing of like what it's doing, what it's not doing, because like with oxytocin, it's associated, the research is kind of associated with peak levels in luteinizing hormone, right? So then obviously luteinizing hormone is very important with ovulation and producing progesterone. And then obviously with someone that's has amenorrhea, they're typically not producing progesterone, or it's extremely low to where it's not allowing them to ovulate, which is a huge part obviously of a female's menstrual cycle, right? So we've been experimenting it within that facet and seeing some very, very, very positive things. And there's other stuff that obviously that we do along with that. It's not like that's a standalone in and of itself. But what are your thoughts on oxytocin?
This is funny because oxytocin it's like you said, it's becoming increasingly popular.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another one of like, people tend to have a reasonably large misunderstanding of what something like dopamine really does, and how it does it. But oxytocin, I would think more so, because we typically hear it called love hormone.
Yep.
And I think that's a pretty inaccurate description of it. And you don't really hear that often, because I think the more accurate descriptor of it, it's the social hormone.
Okay.
Because what it does, and this, you have something called the social salient hypothesis of oxytocin signaling, which basically states, and has been shown a lot of times in humans and rodents to this point, that oxytocin basically regulates and in some ways controls our attention and motivational reactions to both positive and negative social contexts. And excuse me, what I mean by that is that oxytocin seems to increase our processing of salient information within a given social context, whether it's positive or negative. And for people that don't understand what I'm saying, what I mean is salient information would be like social cues that are prominent, that may be important. And we would then tend to pick up on those more and process them more. And then that would influence how we reacted to them. And excuse me. And there's some pretty good examples of this in rodent literature where they took male rodents, excuse me, and they put them in a cage with each other to kind of familiarize them with other male rodents, and they would stimulate like optogenic stimulation of oxytocin signaling. So they with like basically a probe in their head, and they could stimulate oxytocin signaling. And at first, there was a lot of like pro-social behavior. The mice are checking each other out like more than they previously would, because I think prior to introduction, they had been like isolated to be more antisocial. And initially, they're more social and talkative and checking each other out. But excuse me, what they did was they took food out of the cages, and then they would put the food in like during like the nighttime periods where like rats feed a lot at night. But the longer they were triggering the oxytocin, the more the rats started to pick up on, I'm in an environment with very little food and a lot of other males. And that was the information that became salient. It became prominent and important for them to process. And so then eventually they started to become super aggressive with each other, chasing each other around, fighting for the food. And when they weren't when oxytocin wasn't being like stimulated in them, excuse me, then that aggressive behavior wasn't there. But what the mice were picking up on was the prominent social cues of the environment. Like, I'm in here with a lot of other males competing for food. Like, now I need to react this way. And so it doesn't only promote pro-social behavior, but it can promote aversive and aggressive behavior. You have other studies in rodents showing that female rodents, and it's interesting because there's correlations to human females.
Yeah.
We know that like 1 in 4 people at some point in their life are going to suffer from a mood disorder. Women are twice as likely as men to do so. And women tend to supplement with certain things, THC being one of them, more so for mood disorders like anxiety and depression than men do. But, excuse me, rodent studies show that when females are exposed to, say, what they call a social defeat stress, it would trigger social anxiety-like behavior. And when that was triggered, it depends on how much oxytocin how high is oxytocin activity, and also where is the oxytocin being produced, because it's produced in the hypothalamus, but it's also produced in another part of the brain called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And that's thought to be like an extended amygdala. And the amygdala, a lot of people know, processes like fear. Yeah. It processes fear, incoming fear stimuli, and then helps us react accordingly. And when oxytocin was triggered in this one region of the brain, the bed nucleus, then the female mice, they were showing socially aversive behavior and higher vigilance to social situations, which in a normal human being would be social anxiety disorder. And there was an increased protein expression of oxytocin neurons, and then also increased activity of oxytocin for somewhere between 2 to 10 weeks after they had suffered a single social defeat. But when it happened in males, they did not have the same reaction at all. They weren't showing like aversive stimuli. They were still being social with other rodents. Excuse me. And it took multiple exposures, like 2 to 3 socially defeating stimuli to them to trigger the same response. Yeah. But even then, that brain activity did not last nearly as long as it did in the females. It did not last up to 2 weeks like it would in females. It would last like up to 10 days max, and then males would revert back to normal social behavior. So at least in female rodents, and maybe in female humans, well, we know in female humans that they're more susceptible to social anxiety. 100%. And that might be an oxytocin signaling may be one of the prime drivers of that, really just depending on where is the oxytocin signaling happening. But then also, if that signaling continues, it also increases BDNF, which is, that would play a role in helping to restructure certain regions of the brain to kind of learn, I should always be vigilant in social situations. I always have a bit of anxiety. And so you can either be, say, less social or aggressive in certain situations, really depending on a lot of different things, going all the way down to genetics. Yeah. But oxytocin itself it's not only the love hormone. And I think in rodent and human studies, it's been shown that administration of oxytocin, and I think that some of it in humans is intranasal. that same thing. It could promote increased social activity in people who showed less social activity before, but people who were highly social, it might have triggered more aversive or aggressive behavior. And that's been more shown in rodents, but it kind of depends on like what your genetic makeup is and, you know, what your oxytocin signaling looks like at baseline. And then also the time course over which maybe increased levels or increased oxytocin activities happening in the brain. So there's still like a lot to flesh out there, but, but oxytocin doesn't only promote pro-social behavior. It increases our processing of social cues, and depending on the context, that could be considered positive or that could be considered negative.
Yeah.
So oxytocin right now, at least mainstream, is one of the most misunderstood neurochemicals.
Yeah, because I'm just hearing a lot more, especially out in the practitioner world, the use of it, or the testing, I guess, of the use of it, and in efficacy, and like how is it beneficial. And the realm I'm seeing it more used, because obviously what I do is more so with female, is pretty much for females, and it is to help more from the hormonal perspective and from the LH and menstrual cycles and stuff. Now I've seen some other things used when they're dealing with like depression or anxiety, depending on how serious that may or may not be. But it's 100%. I've never seen anything done with it in males, as far as like supplementing or exogenous form of it. And so my kind of knowledge base is definitely purely around the female and just hormonal. But that's very interesting, that all that stuff that you said, because I mean, I've thought that way, but I've never ever heard it explained the way you just explained it. So that definitely opens my mind up to a lot more of what it does or what it can do, and not kind of pigeonholed into what you see put out on social media or whatever, and these little blurps like it's the love hormone, it's blah, 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 blah. But it can have, it's a positive, negative. I mean, like with anything, I mean, there's always going to be a positive and negative. It's never just like one that's the best drug or supplement in the world, and it's got all these positive benefits with no downside to it. Right. I wish that was the case for most things. Well, that was a lot of information, guys. So thanks again, Will, for coming on. We are definitely going to have him back on because he's just a wealth of knowledge. And I'm going to rewatch this and take some notes as well.
So this might have to be a 3-part. This one might have to be a 3-part.
This is definitely a 2-part. Oh, okay. This is a 2-parter. But guys, thanks again for watching. If you could, please leave us a 5-star rating, subscribe to our channel, some positive reviews. Will, what's the best way for them to follow you? Like, what's your Instagram handle?
My Instagram handle is @Will_the_Wallace, and that, at least until I'm done my PhD, is probably my primary outlet for the information or getting a hold of me.
So this is the brains behind our supplementation formula, guys. So I tell you, we have the best of the best when it comes to our formulating and quality, and the obviously synergy of what we put in our products. And obviously you can see the intelligence of Will and his thought process behind this. So again, guys, thanks for watching the Revivecast and listening to us, and we'll talk to you soon.